Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this afternoon's webinar. My name's Andy Sherritt. I'm from IT Health, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's webinar is all around privileged access management, and we'll be featuring a customer story from NHS Lanarkshire. Just one piece of housekeeping, really. Questions. We definitely want your questions, please. So if you wouldn't mind posting them in the chat box, I'll be monitoring those throughout the webinar, and we'll look forward to answering them at the end of the session. In terms of introductions, who's going to be on the webinar today? I'm Andy from IT Health. Most of you will know me. I'll hand you over to Tom, first of all, please, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tom, pre-sales engineer here at Osirium. I've worked closely with Mark in the past and also worked closely with Andy on these types of sessions. I've been in the PAM space for a couple of years now, working both at Osirium and in previous life working for another vendor, in particular working at that vendor, but also from a partner perspective as well.
Thanks, Tom. Over to you, Mark.
Mark Grant, Infrastructure Operations Manager for NHS Lancashire. I've been in that post for about 4 years. The team I work in is mainly focused on the day-to-day operational side of IT security.
Thank you, Mark. I'm very grateful for you joining us today. So I'm just going to give a very brief intro to both IT Health and to PAM in general before handing over to Tom. I think there's lots of familiar faces on the webinar today, or lots of familiar names, I should say, so thanks very much for joining us. Most of you obviously know IT Health already, but just in case anyone doesn't, we are NHS IT security specialists. We've got a portfolio of solutions and services that are all geared towards cyber and assurance for the NHS. We work with a lot of kind of the best vendors on the market. Most of these will be familiar to you, I'm sure. I'm not going to dwell on them too much, but we also at IT Health develop some of our own solutions as well. So we've got the assurance dashboard, and we've got Secure It, which is all around secure remote access. But today's session is all around Osirium and how we help with PAM requirements. So what is PAM and why do you need it? It's all about securing access to systems. All trusts need to have privileged users, but by their very nature, they can do some damage when they're abused. So we see that there are three main threat vectors. You've got the external threat, which could be ransomware. You've also got internal threats, which obviously are going to be employees, well-intentioned or not. And you've also got the third-party threat, so suppliers, third parties connecting in, that doing damage to your systems. So without PAM, I think you're going to suffer from a lack of control and a lack of visibility, and that's going to become quite costly for you to manage. Oh, apologies. Just skipped a slide there. Whereas PAM is going to help you address that. So from a user perspective, the privileged account or the privileged user logs into the PAM platform, and from there, they're only given access to the system that they need. So it means that you can kind of get away from giving full VPN or RDP access to servers. And the beauty of that means that you can restrict users to access only those kind of specific applications that they need. And I think you'll probably hear from Tom that they talk a lot around how Osirium helps you to separate people from passwords, which can be extremely powerful because it means that your privileged users don't need to know the credentials. That means that Osirium can manage those passwords, making them highly complex and regularly changing, which kind of ensures that those critical systems are remaining secure. I think as with all PAM solutions, that privileged access is also recorded and it's fully auditable. So it gives you a complete solution, not only for your internal admins, but also for third parties that are connecting in. So why is PAM such a hot topic in the NHS right now? Why have we put this webinar on ultimately? I think it's fair to say that NCSC are pretty clear in their guidance around PAM. you can see we've captured this screenshot from the NCSC website, which talks around how NCSC are recommending PAM to secure your high value backups from ransomware attacks. I think it's probably also fair to say that this guidance has driven the recent NHS Digital Funding Initiative for PAM. So I think a lot of you on today's call will have submitted your bids for that 10k of funding per trust for PAM. So yeah, fingers crossed, NHSD are going to be issuing out that funding so that you can kind of start your journey on PAM, initially with securing the backups or potentially some of the high value assets. Aside from that NCSC guidance, obviously within the NHS, you've got the DSPT. Like it or loathe it, it's something that the NHS do need to comply with and respond to. And there are some sections within the DSPT these days around PAM. Only thing to say really is that Osirium will address all of those requirements within the current DSPT. And if you do want some more information on that, we've got a white paper. We'll issue that to you as a follow-up to this webinar, but essentially it goes through those evidence requirements from the DSPT and how Osirium can address them. So I've covered, hopefully very briefly, why PAM is important and why it's a hot topic in the NHS right now. The only other thing for me to say really is just to give you some assurances. We've, as far as IT health are concerned, we've partnered with Osirium now for a good number of years. So we've built up some strong reference sites out there. More than happy to put you in touch with some of these. Obviously, Mark from NHS Lanarkshire has very kindly joined us today as well. I also understand that there's some good feedback on the CAN forum recently around Osirium and how it's helping other trusts with PAM. But yeah, hopefully that was useful just to give a quick overview of IT health and PAM in the current environment. I'm now going to pass you over to Tom, who's going to give a short demonstration of the platform. Tom, I'll pass you the presenter role and over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Andy. So just whilst this, I'm setting up the screen sharing over here, just going to go through, for today's session, we'll have a look at a brief overview of actually using the platform, and then we'll take a look at some of the audit data that we capture as part of that as well. So I'll probably take around about 12 to 15 minutes just to set the scene before we hand over to Mark. So if you do have any questions, Andy, if you wouldn't mind logisticizing those in the chat for me,
yeah.
I can try and reply to them as we go through if we have time. So access then into the platform initially is based over a browser, as you can see. So whether you are an internal user or if even it's a remote third party connecting in, as long as they have access to this interface and they've got permission to log in, of course, they will be able to access. So what that means initially is that there's no workstation agent or anything that has to be done on the user's end solely over a browser. So in my environment, I'm logging in as my standard non-privileged AD user, which is in fact linked to my _ADM account. So in my environment, I've got a standard user and I have several named privileged accounts because I'm following the Microsoft recommended 2-account approach there for privileged access. So at this point, it's the non-privileged user authenticating in. However, you can also implement and configure local users to the platform as well. So if you wanted to remove third parties from your Active Directory, that's possible as well. And we also have the token code field box here. So if you wanted to integrate PAM with MFA, the user would then enter the MFA response into that field there, or approve a push notification on their phone, however that MFA has been implemented. So once the user is authenticated, they are then displayed a list of devices which we grant them access to from their profile membership. So a profile is something that you will configure in the back end, and the profile controls the device, the level of access the user has, what tools they can use, what tasks they can run, and we'll get onto those a little bit later, and ultimately who those users are. So you might say that everyone that's in the network admins group and Active Directory should inherit permissions to the root accounts on the firewalls. Pretty much as it is with the profile membership, build those in from their AD group membership. However, in certain environments, I would expect you to think about providing least privilege. So this user can access, if we scroll through, connections to AWS, connections to a domain controller, connections to some Unix-based networking equipment, and some various other type of demo examples for today. but you might experience something slightly different for your environment. Your Wintel engineers may only access the Windows servers, as an example. So if we just take a look, we can see that we can access domain controllers using direct connections to file systems such as RDP, and also using thick client applications to make those connections as well. Additionally, you can also implement workflow. So if your user needs to submit a request before they can connect to a device, example, internal users, we may trust them enough to connect 24/7, as well as if they work shifts. However, for third parties, we don't want them to have that carte blanche access. So therefore, we're going to make them have to go through a request approval, which then needs to get approved internally before that access can be granted. So starting to think about providing just-in-time access there as well. And there's a few other systems in here that I have access to on a demo environment. So let's now say that PAM has been rolled out and we've got access to hundreds of devices. Scrolling through like I've just done isn't really efficient. So users can search for devices based on address. So for example, IP address here. I could also search via hostname as well, so DC01. Interestingly enough, with Osirium as well, a differentiator for us is the ability for you to configure your own custom metadata-based searching. So if you wanted to group devices by device type or location geographically, as I'm demonstrating here, or even I've tagged some of my devices that are in my DMZ, so showing me all the devices over there. So I'm able to find the device that I'm looking for and find it quickly. So if we just take a look at the DC then as this first example, this could even be connecting to something like VM if we're running one of those thick clients. However, as we've explored with a number of NHS trusts, it's not just providing access to backups that we're looking for, it's actually looking that PAM can fit in other areas as well. So we'll try and make this as generic as possible, but know that those backup scenarios are definitely supported, and we've got video collateral and material of us actually showing us using it internally. So for this example then, we'll initially connect over RDP first of all. We could use the local administrator account. As I mentioned at the start, I could get mapped onto my _ADM. Now these accounts are now being rotated by PAM. So I've gone through the state of discovering and then working these accounts up to the level of management where I no longer know what the passwords are. Osirium is automatically rotating them for me on a time basis, and also ensuring that those passwords are long and complex. So therefore, eventually the end goal will be that all access that's privileged will need to go through PAM, where we can benefit from the audit as well. So in order to connect, all I would do is click on the connection. As we're being recorded now, I have to accept the terms of use. So we'll just click on OK. And what's happening here is our solution is actually initiating this connection on the user's behalf. So on our virtual appliance that initiates the connection, we're retrieving the credential from the encrypted database as to where the credentials are stored, establishing the connection, injecting the credential, and then displaying it back to the user. So how it's displayed to the user is this is in fact an SSL connection that the user can see. And as I can see, it looks and feels like any native direct connection. However, as it's initiated from the context of the user's browser, if we just run a command that we can filter on later, nothing is ever going backwards towards the user's workstation. So there's no remote app files or RDP files that get initiated from the user's workstation, which means that the user's not able to scrape the credential. And additionally as well, if I'm making a direct connection and if I have a piece of malware running on my workstation, that malware could be able to propagate over a 3389 connection. So as we're displaying these connections over SSL, there's no way that malware is able to propagate. Additionally as well, I'm less vulnerable to a man-in-the-middle type attack. These sessions are encrypted as well, so it's a secure remote session. But what it looks like to the target device is an RDP connection, but how it's displayed to the user is over 443. So as we've already mentioned, these type of direct file system type connections, I'll refer to them as ones that we typically only really reserve for the most privileged members of staff. So domain admins, or even in the network world, we just have a quick example of this one, it could be a network admin. So similar example again, opening up an SSH session using the admin account on a firewall. However, I'm not recording this session. So you can then start to think about recording sessions based on the criticality of that device. Is that something that's a backup scenario where I need to make sure I record all of the access, or is it connectivity to a database that's hosting patient data, as an example? We need to make sure that access there is always recorded. But for maybe a test system, for example, you may not want to record that access. So we'll just exit this session here. So we can go one step further and look to provide access to specific applications. So a scenario could be a third party needs to connect to a clinical application on a server that ultimately belongs to you, where you don't really want to give that third party direct access to that system because they've got access to the file system. They could go and access something else or look at data or laterally move, do all kinds of things that they may not supposed to be able to do. So with the Osirium PAM solution, you can provide them access to just that application. So they can only access what they're supposed to be doing. So it's thinking around back to that providing least privilege approach. We only give a user what they need to do their job. So if I'm a level 2 engineer in a help desk, I may not be trusted enough to have full-blown RDP access to the DC. I just need to be able to administrate the users of the domain. So don't overprivilege me. Give me just access to Active Directory using computers, as you can see. So I can come in here and I can administrate the users of my domain. We'll just go ahead and maybe reset somebody's password. We're able to still carry out our activities within the application because of the level of privileged account that we're using. But there's no way that I may be tempted to use something that I'm not supposed to, or simply do something and make a mistake. So with our capabilities, you can then start to think about providing access to these applications rather than having to give somebody direct access to the file system. Another example of one of these graphical or thick client type connections is connectivity to something over a web browser. Now, it could be Azure, it could be Office 365, it could be an internal application, it could be AWS. What we're able to demonstrate here is the ability to allow someone to use a privileged account in a interface that is a web portal. So similar sort of connection. I've clicked on the connection and we're opening it within the browser tab again here, as you can see. What we're going to do with a web-based connection is automatically send the login address, as you can see. And then when we detect the username and password fields for the credentials, we then send those, which means that credentials aren't sat around in memory anywhere. And then what the user's left with is a recorded session into that web portal using a privileged credential that they no longer know or have ownership of, and they can access that through PAM. So in this example, I could be prevented from putting DevOps secrets into AWS as an example. We'll come out of there. So I've kind of really covered the two main examples of allowing someone access to connect to something. Just before I move on, I didn't actually mention this DNS access here. PAM can also provide a fully automated role-based access control model, which could be particularly interesting for looking to use least privilege when third parties come in, and we can automatically create users accounts that they need that have specific levels of permission or roles on that target. So we can automatically provision and manage those accounts as well. So you don't need to overprivilege somebody or have to create an account manually for somebody when they need it. So that's also something to bear in mind as well. So we've covered connectivity to devices either by remote desktop or SSH that we typically reserve for the most privileged members of the team. We've also got access to specific applications, whether it's thick client snap-ins and MMCs, or it might be for a DBA to use just a DBA tool. We can go one step further at Osirium, and is a unique differentiator for us, is the ability to provide a user access to just a privileged task. So what this means is that in today's world, we might have to delegate these tasks to the more senior members of the team because they're the ones with the privilege and the access to do this. When I'm talking around a privileged task, I'm referring to something that is essential to the running of the environment that we do on a daily basis, that we could probably do blindfold if we do them so many times, is things like restarting a service, user account management, setting ports on firewalls, those kind of things, running backups, etc. Those sorts of tasks that are essential to the running of the business, of the environment, but ultimately do require that level of privilege. Now, what we can do is delegate those tasks out to maybe level 1 engineers in a help desk, or even third parties where they can run just a task on a regular basis. You can also set these up to run on schedules as well, without that user actually having to connect to that device at all. So if you want to shift left some of these tasks, this is possible with Osirium. So for this example, again, we've got access to run some tasks on the domain controller. We could do something as simple as disabling a domain account of potentially somebody that may have gone rogue. What we normally do is simply log the ticket and escalate it further up the help desk. which isn't necessarily too productive, because if the more senior members of the team are working on projects or transformation type stuff, that can in fact create a bit of a bottleneck where these keeping the lights on tasks may fall by the wayside or get left. So when I'm interacting with this task, I'm actually interacting on a wizard-like approach. So I'm first of all going to be asked for my input, which is the name of the account, which is disable me. I then choose the device to execute the task. If I'm pushing this task to multiple systems, e.g. a firewall rule change or a switch port or something, you can select multiple devices there, but we'll just go against the one and then press yes. So what's happened here is, from the user's perspective, this task is completed much quicker than I could ever do it manually. I'm not exposed to any privileged credentials. I don't have to use any privileged accounts. I don't have to connect to the system at all. I can simply log into PAM, and if I'm doing something that may take me an hour a day to do manually, I could potentially maybe break that out into some tasks where I can run them in a couple of minutes and then get on with the more important mission critical stuff. Just as another example, we'll demonstrate restarting a service, where in this example, as we know, in order to access services, you need to connect over RDP and use an administrator account. Let's say for a third party, they may need to update the service of their application that sits on a server. So we can pre-configure and pre-allow the user to only select the services that you've granted them, choose the device, and then execute the task. And as we see here, this task is successfully completed. So that's the typical types of access that you can start thinking about providing. We can be quite open or as granular as the requirements suggest. But we'll now jump into the admin interface, which is accessible if you are a super admin or an auditor of PAM, just to look at the audit data that we capture as part of the activity. And that's all captured under the device access report. Before I go any further, there is other integrations that we can offer, things like integration with Seams. You can get real-time alerts, email alerts when people are doing things as well. As you can see with some of the other reporting that's available, we do offer things like behavior analytics as well, and other bits and pieces that, if that's of a particular interest, we can always cover that on another session. But here we have the device access report, which really captures who did what, where, when, how, and why. So if we just take a look at the report, we can see things like starts and end times of sessions, durations of sessions versus how long someone was actually active on a duration for, where they've connected to, who they are, where they've come from, what privilege they've used, and if anyone has approved that request for a session, whether the session's recorded or not as well. So all of these sessions can be filtered on, as you can see, by entering fields in the column. If we don't record a session, we'll still capture the metadata about that session. So we know that admin is being rotated by PAM. So if something happened at that time, Tom was the only one that was using the account, therefore it was Tom that may have done whatever has happened. But if we have a recording, we can actually play back a video. And we can go one step further and actually filter on particular events and keystrokes that we have detected within that session. So we ran the who am I command earlier, so let's filter on all of the sessions where that command has been detected. There's our one from earlier on this afternoon. We'll just press play. We'll set the playback speed to fastest, and then we'll press play. So the video will play back there, and you can see this is the session where we have detected this command or keystroke that's been run. So whether you need to review these as part of a change to track what's been done forensically, or if you just want to create documentation, those recordings can be able to provide those for you. I think that brings me to the end of my allocated slot for time that I had with the demo. I think I've taken around about 15 minutes there, so I haven't seen any questions come through.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Tom. Yeah, it's Andy here again. So yeah, there is one question which we may as well ask you now whilst you're there. So questions come in and I'll just read it verbatim. What stops current administrators bypassing PAM and say logging into a DC with their ADM account?
Excellent, that's a great question. So these accounts, when they're in PAM, you can configure the different states of management, where ultimately the end goal is to have PAM rotate those credentials so that the user no longer knows or has the actual password. So if I have written down my ADM account password on a post-it note, and then we onboard that account into PAM. We can set it into what we call a known state, where we tell PAM what the password is, but we don't actually manage it, purely just to get the users on board with using it. There may be, after a week or so of demonstrating to the user, look, your life is much easier with PAM because all you do is click. You now no longer have to remember a privileged password anymore. You can then start to enable that management of that account, where Osirium takes ownership of the password and then rotates it on a time basis. So if I were to try and connect directly, I would no longer know the version of the password. Therefore, I can't bypass PAM. I need to use PAM to get access to that credential.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, Tom. It's probably worth mentioning as well that access into PAM can be as secure as they need it to be, right? So we can integrate with two-factor authentication or.
Certainly.
Good. Okay, I'll just grab the presenter back and share my screen again.
Excellent. By the way, guys, if just before I hand back to Andy, if anyone does have any questions after digesting and processing what I've shown you, do put them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as we can. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And yeah, okay, that more questions the better, please, everyone. So that's kind of covered the intro and the demo. As I said earlier, very kindly joined by Mark from NHS Lanarkshire, just to kind of share their journey and how they've approached PAM. So Mark, I'll give you control and over to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi guys, so I'm Mark Grant, Infrastructure Operations Manager for NHS Lanarkshire. So I'll give you a brief kind of overview. Oh, too far. So here's a kind of bit of brief information around the board. So we serve around a population of around 650,000 people. We have 3 main acute sites, 15 community hospitals and 90 plus GP surgeries. We have around about 14,500 staff, 200 plus admin accounts and 300 plus service accounts. And we've now got around about 15,000 Windows client machines and 900 servers. About 750 of them are virtual. So why did we look at PAM? Well, obviously everybody remembers WannaCry, so that was a kind of catalyst for change. It became clear that the process and procedures had to change, not only to bring us in line with the new compliance and regulations being pushed out by the Scottish Government, but also to ensure we kept access to our systems as controlled and secure as possible. So our main concerns were around third-party suppliers. There was a lot of blind faith in a lot of suppliers who tend to have free rein to access the key systems, leading to potential for supply chain attack. Added to that, we didn't actually know what our own staff were up to. So it gave us greater visibility to see who was accessing the systems, when and what they were doing when they were on there. And it kind of gave us a better control to reduce and restrict access and obviously bring us into compliance with the Cyber Essentials. Can't get to the next slide. Oh, there we go. So our approach was we kind of had our initial investigation of the key providers of PAM. We attended webinars, peer reviews, etc. And we shortlisted down to 3 companies and solutions. We undertook 3 POCs. We had a final evaluation review and cost analysis. And in the end, we chose Osirium. That provided us not only a robust solution, but competitive price with excellent engagement and support. So it was a phased rollout initially. We targeted third-party suppliers close to our team, mainly to give us ease of access to them, engagement with them as well as easier. And we also then targeted new suppliers who were coming into our systems, and also key admin staff, especially kind of domain admins or anyone with kind of heightened privileges across the IT staff. So what benefits? Obviously meeting the compliance, that was the main goal. We massively improved controls and visibility, especially through the session recording. And in the end, there was less staff and resource overhead than was needed. With increased visibility, as I said, but the reporting, especially the device access reporting, regularly, or when an irregular event has been flagged up in our SIEM tool. So the next steps for us are continued the kind of phased approach. So we're going to target larger suppliers with extensive access across our board, mainly in our GP estate. We're going to aim to get delegated internal access to other teams to be able to manage their own suppliers, meaning less resource needed within our team. We're looking at network kit. So it's already monitored in our SIEM, but we need more control of who's accessing and what they do when they're on there. And then lastly is probably automation in terms of our service desk team being able to assist in the PAM solution itself. So I've kind of went through that quite faster than I thought, but if there's any questions, I'm quite happy to answer.
Thank you, Mark. Nicely done. I'll just take back control so I can review we have had quite a few questions, so I'll kind of rattle through those. Some of these will be for Tom and some for yourself, Mark. So I'll start with this one. I think this is quite an easy one, Tom. The remote, guessing the remote will work on a virtual machine / cloud environment?
Yeah, absolutely. We connect to devices over native ports and protocols, so it doesn't matter if it's a virtual machine or a physical machine, as long as it responds to RDP or SSH connectivity, then that's fine. And similarly with cloud, again, we'll just make a 443 HTTPS connection to that cloud platform, or if it's a device in the cloud, as long as we've got network routing to it. Alternatively, just to expand on that a little bit more, if you wanted to deploy a PAM in the cloud as well as on premise, that is also possible as well. So if you wanted a device, a PAM server more closer to the target, whether it's in a cloud or a DMZ, you can also deploy another virtual appliance in there. We don't charge by the number of appliances that you deploy, so you can really achieve a resilient architecture with that as well.
Yeah, perfect. Glad you said that, because that's actually covered the next question, which was all around where it's hosted. So yeah, there's options available basically. Just going through some more questions. I'll stick with you for now, Tom. So there's a question here, it's kind of a bit hypothetical. If the PAM solution is unavailable, how do you then get access for
Excellent
manual
question.
processing?
So product supports a number of different resiliency options, and from someone that's been in this for a fair while, I don't think it's possible for a PAM solution to be too resilient. So we'd always recommend to think about using at least two methods of resiliency. So first one is we can integrate with the virtual appliance, the virtual hypervisor in terms of cloning and restoring VMs from there. Certainly from a product perspective, we support the product being deployed in a fully active cluster, but also in an active passive disaster recovery setup as well. And the product can also be configured to send backups to a SAN or a NAS. So a combination of maybe either or two of those, I would say. Normally the example architecture that I talk around is a active cluster of PAM servers, and you may also have a passive node in the cloud as an example, where if two data centers that the cluster is spread across, if they were to go down or become inaccessible, then at least we've got something fairly recent that we can fail back to. So it's just all about understanding the sort of the risks that you may have, and then coming up and designing a architecture that's fit for purpose, but also highly available and resilient as well.
Yeah, thank you. So Tom, I've got two more for you still, and then Mark, there are some for yourself as well. So next one for you, Tom. Some systems we have require a service account to remain logged into the server for the system to function. And in some other cases, we have to use a service account to run services on a server. Typically, these accounts are the same that a third party would use. How would PAM affect this model or this method?
So I guess there's two parts of that question. So as well as supporting and using domain accounts, local accounts, we can also discover service accounts and the dependencies that actually use those services. So for example, we could discover an account, and we can also be configured to, if we reset the password of that service account, we can then also configure an action to the service, e.g. restart the service, so it gets the new credentials. If a third party is going to humanly use those, we can grant them access. I would recommend that you or it depends, the service accounts, you may not want to restart them on a regular basis, but if human beings are using them, then we may need to come up with or design a appropriate password management cycle for those. What you could also do is use the role-based access to create a temporary account for the third party. So a benefit of the role-based is that when we create the account when we see someone needs access, but then after the user has been offboarded, so third party may only log into PAM for 2 hours. After that 2-hour period has expired, the user then gets disabled. Then we will go ahead and delete any role-based accounts we've created for them. So we could also use that as a solution as well. So the account that they're using is temporary, and we're also enforcing least privilege. So there's some different solutions that we can take there, but I think we may need to explore that one in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, that's definitely, Lee, if you want to have a separate conversation, more than happy to set something up with Tom after this. And lastly, we've got another really good question, actually. Thank you, Paul, around the licensing model. So just kind of a little bit concerned. We've, as a lot of you will know, IT Health put together some packages geared towards the NHS digital funding. The funding was supposed to be just for 10 licenses. So the question from Paul is around what, he's got loads of administrators, lots of external suppliers that need to connect in. What does the 10 device license limit him to, if that makes sense?
So our product is licensed not on the users that log in, but the target devices that you want to manage access to. So let's say, for an example, I've got 25 Windows servers, I've got 2 ESXi hosts, and I've got 3 firewalls. That will be, if my maths is correct, a 25 device license. So we license per the target that we will connect to, not the users coming in. From an architecture perspective and an appliance count, we don't license by the number of appliances that you deploy. But if you're thinking also about providing remote access, we can deploy what we call a PAM UI server, which is just the web server functionality of the PAM virtual appliance. So you can split that off and deploy a completely separate appliance in a DMZ where you can enable that secure remote access. It's not the actual PAM server that's exposed to the internet, it's just that web server. And then we form like an internal air gap connection to the PAM server that's on the inside of the network. But from a licensing perspective, we are concerned for the number of devices that you'll connect to rather than the number of users actually using the platform, which may work out quite nicely if you've got fluctuating users and different numbers of users coming in and out of the system.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, Paul, yeah, just a follow-up question that you submitted, Paul. If you've got 300 servers or devices and 20 administrators, then if you want to cover all of those devices, you'd need 300 licenses. The 10, if you're just going to buy 10, that would be covering you for 10 pieces of equipment. So you're, maybe a backup infrastructure, domain controllers, and then you could expand out in batches from there if that was the approach you wanted to take.
Yeah, just to add a bit more on that, Andy, as well, if you've got Office 365, then that's also just one device as a license. Same for the Azure portal, that's one device license as well. Most commonly, though, if you do have something like 300 devices, it's not very too common that a lot of organizations will go for all 300 at once. And I think the fact that we can go out in packs or packs of 10 or however many, I mean, I'm not a commercial. The commercial is not my responsibility, but certainly from what other customers have done is start small and work their way up, just to make sure that the project's manageable. It often completes a lot quicker sooner if you're sort of addressing the devices in by right criticality. So I need to secure access to my backup infrastructure first. I've got 10 servers there. We'll get those onboarded and we'll work the accounts up, the various different states, get users on board, get them familiar with using it, and then we'll start to think, right, what's my next area of concern or risk that I should look to address.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And Paul, I think I'll get Chris Booth to follow up with you after this, just on the specific of your licensing requirements. But that leads quite nicely, actually, into some other questions, which are going to be for yourself, Mark. We've kind of got several questions all around how long did it take you to get PAM off the ground? Where did you start? And did you buy all of your licenses up front, or have you sort of bought bundles and then added? If you wouldn't mind covering those, please.
Yeah, so initially we bought our licenses up front, but prior to carrying out the work. We had to do some internal housekeeping with accounts, just for to reduce the amount of admin accounts and service accounts. I think that was a key part to the actual kind of it being such a kind of a good project for us, because I think if we'd had hundreds, thousands of admin accounts that we did initially, we would have struggled to try and keep that kind of ring fenced in.
Yeah, and how quickly, once you'd sort of made the decision to go with the Osirium, how long did it take you to? I guess, where did you start? What was your top priority?
The kind of top priority was our kind of well, obviously third-party support, but we wanted to control our key systems first, our key infrastructure systems, so our domain controllers, backup servers, our SQL clusters, our converged infrastructure hosts, and management servers. So we kind of started there because they were quite close to our team, to kind of get the team up to kind of level of knowledge and experience of the system. And then we started to kind of push out to third-party suppliers and other IT staff across the estate.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Mark. Just trying to see if there's anything else we haven't covered. So there's a question for you again, Mark, on, I think you've kind of covered it there, really. Obviously, the central funding that's being pushed out, I know it's not for Scotland, it's actually just NHS England, but that's been focused on backup systems. You know, how did that sit overall in your priorities? It sounds like it was up there along with some of the other critical systems, basically.
Yeah, I think going back to the whole WannaCry incident that kind of started this kind of ball rolling, we relied heavily on our backups to restore our servers, so that was obviously a key system that we wanted to protect. So yeah, that was one of the systems that was on the top of the list anyway. So we wanted to kind of protect access to it, because it controls the servers within our main converged infrastructure. There's around about 750 servers in there, but it allowed it to delegate access for restoring to separate departments, so they can actually now get in and restore themselves rather than having to rely on another team, the backup team, to actually carry that out for them. So even though they don't have access in mainly to the system to make changes, but they can actually carry out restores.
Yeah, makes sense. And then I've got one more now for you, Tom. Will the solution randomize network equipment passwords as well? Do you manage switches and routers?
Yeah, everything. So when you onboard a device into Osirium, you attach it to what we have as a corresponding template, and on the template there is the password. There is the password policy on there. So by default, they normally ship with the most random and complex passwords that target can physically handle. So I think for things like Cisco routers, I think it's a maximum password length of 128 characters. So by default, we'll be generating accounts that have 128 character passwords. But that is something that's configurable, and if you wanted to change that, you can. But yes, that does apply for whether it's an administrator account, a root account, an enable account, ADM accounts, etc., etc. Yes, that applies to all accounts. You just specify the policy in the template.
Perfect. Oh, another question for you, Mark. If you don't mind revealing, what backup products are you securing with the PAM?
It's Veeam.
Veeam. Okay, great. So that's everything. Thank you, everyone that's attended, for all those questions. It's nice to get some. We don't always, so appreciate that, and very much grateful to yourself, Mark, for giving us your time, and thank you very much, Tom, for an excellent demo as always. As I said, more than happy to follow up with one-to-one calls or demos if you want to get deeper into any of that stuff that Tom showed earlier. The only thing left for me to say is thanks again for joining us. Please do complete the survey, which you'll get served as soon as you finish the webinar, and we will be sending you a recording of this so that you can distribute it amongst any colleagues that couldn't attend. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, and bye-bye for now.